So let me just start this presentation with a short excerpt of my personal life story. This was me 14 years ago with all the spiky hair. I was trying this morning, I was trying to replicate that, but I don't know if I was quite successful. It was my last year in the university as a statistics major. And during our last semester, we were tasked to undergo a job internship program in one of the national government agencies that compile official statistics in the Philippines. The first task that was assigned to me was to review the official poverty estimation in the country. And what struck me is the poverty line that they were using. It was approximately 70,000 pesos per year for a family of 5. So adjusting for differences in purchasing power and inflation, that's about less than $2 a day per person. And I told myself, that's not possible. It's quite hard to be that poor. But then, a few weeks after, I met this guy. His name is Pedro. He was an exchange student in our university. During under that program, many students from different rural areas were invited, just to give them a glimpse of what college life is all about. And I was tasked to be Pedro's guide. And then as we talked, I learned that Pedro came from a quite poor family. Every day he has to wake up at say 4 in the morning just to prepare palitaw, a type of boiled sticky rice shaped into flat discs and dipped into grated coconut, sugar, and toasted sesame seeds. And then he heads off to their neighborhood to sell those homemade rice cakes. And then after 4 hours of selling, he would go to a farm which his father is toiling. He will help his father stick rice seedlings into their paddy. And then at around noontime, he will walk for 4 kilometers just to reach the high school that he's attending to, which is located at the town center. And right after classes, he would rush to a nearby market where he used to work as an errand boy. He carried sacks of rice for customers. And per sack of rice, he earned about $0.25. So during good times, he would probably earn enough to buy a kilo of rice, probably some eggs, and a chicken meat to be served for dinner to their family. But on average, they will have to share with few loaves of bread and fish. So that was my first close encounter with poverty. But over time, as I worked with development agencies like the Asian Development Bank, I learned that these kind of disparities in living standards really exist, and they are replicated all over the world. So even if we are witnessing global economic growth, more millionaires and billionaires are being created, there are still areas where children are dying before the age of 5 due to malnutrition. And average life expectancy is less than 50 years. And more than half of the population are living with less than $2 a day. So having seen such glaring disparities, in September 2000, more than 150 countries agreed on 8 lofty goals, from eradicating extreme poverty to reducing child mortality to forging global partnership for global development. The Millennium Development Goals span multiple dimensions of economic development. And as the deadlines draws near, which happens to be next year, 2015, this progress chart shows us where we stand with respect to these goals. So the rows of this chart correspond to the different targets under each goal, while the columns represent the different geographic regions in the world. The green boxes are for those targets that have already been attained. The yellow boxes correspond to targets whose achievement is on course, while the red boxes are those that are unlikely to be achieved. So let's just focus on the first goal, which is the one of the main focus of my study: eradicate extreme poverty and hunger. Under this goal, there are three targets: reduce extreme poverty by half between 1990 and 2015, to promote productive employment and decent employment, and to reduce hunger by half. What we can get from this table or figure is that substantial gains have already been attained with respect to this goal. In particular, if we look at the number of absolutely poor, in 1990, there were about 2 billion people who live with less than $1.25 a day, US dollar in terms of purchasing power parity. But then in 2010, there were 700 million fewer people who live in extreme poverty. And then by a decade from now, they are expecting that there will only be about 250 million poor people. And most of this observed reduction in the number of absolutely poor can be attributed to the economic growth that we have witnessed. However, if we look at the distribution of the benefits of economic growth, we can see that it tends to have benefited the rich disproportionately more. In other words, if we look at the level of inequality, it's actually increasing. So just to give us a sense of the level of inequality now, suppose we divide the global population into 5 equal groups. So as we move from left to right, we have the poorest 20%, which we call poorest quintile, to the richest quintile. Now, suppose we compute the share of the income for each quintile. That is, we compute the total income of each income quintile and divide that by total income across all quintiles. What we can see is that the richest 20% owns more than 90% of the total global wealth. And this level of inequality is much higher compared to what we have seen in the past. For instance, if we look back 200 years ago, the rich countries were only 3 times richer than poor countries. By the 1960s, rich countries were already 35 times richer. But today, according to some estimates, rich countries are already 80 times richer than poor countries. So we get this mixed picture of development. So on one hand, we see a reduction in the number of absolutely poor, but on the other hand, we are witnessing increasing inequality. However, there is some methodological issue about this. So far, to be able to arrive to this conclusion, we have used, the analytical tools that we have used are cross-sectional trends in poverty and income inequality. What I'm saying is that, for example, we estimate for each time point, we estimate the poverty rate and the income inequality, and then we do that for different time periods, and we can compare the estimates over time. So it's like taking static snapshots of the poverty and inequality status. Well, it's not totally a flawed approach if our main objective is to simply provide a general picture of economic development. But the problem is, it does not really tell us adequate information about what happened to the initially poor, or what happened to the initially rich. So consider this hypothetical population, wherein we have 10 people. Initially, there were 4 rich and 6 were poor. And suppose in the subsequent time period, looks odd, all rich became poor and all poor became rich. And furthermore, suppose that the incomes of the initially poor are now much higher to the incomes of the initially rich. So given that, we will observe a 20 percentage point reduction in poverty, but we will also observe increasing income inequality. Well, some researchers suggest that increasing inequality could be of less concern when there is income mobility, because with income mobility, you're essentially giving opportunities to the poor to catch up with the rich. However, the reversal of the incomes may also portray a very unstable income distribution, and that these scenarios have different policy implications. The thing is, if we're looking at cross-sectional data, it's hard to gauge which of these scenarios hold, because we do not follow the same set of individuals. So in this study, what I want to capture is to probe beyond the cross-sectional poverty and inequality trends and provide a more longitudinal perspective when examining the income distribution. Okay, so what makes the Philippines an interesting case study for examining income mobility? Well, probably most of us know that the Asia-Pacific region is one of the fastest growing regions in the world. And within Asia, the Philippines is one of the most rapidly growing economies. For instance, in 2012, estimates from Asian Development Bank suggest that Philippines grew by approximately 6%. And preliminary estimates for 2013 suggest that Philippines grew much faster compared to other key Asian players like Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. However, if we look at the historical income growth profile of the Philippines, this has not always been the case. It experienced several boom and bust cycles. For instance, another thing is that the Philippines has had lower growth elasticity of poverty for many years, which eventually earned its title Sick Man of Asia for like several decades. However, starting 2000, Philippines posted quite more rapid economic growth compared to what it had seen in the past. And preliminary estimates based on more recent data suggest that it's gaining more momentum from the past years. So that said, this rapid growth episode for the Philippines is a critical juncture, according to experts. If that can be complemented with appropriate mix of socioeconomic policies, then Philippines might be the next Asian tiger. However, if it continues to benefit a privileged few, then this growth episode might just end up as a part of the perennial boom and bust cycle of the Philippines. Another interesting thing about studying developing countries. Within ISSR, I think we have had, and we currently have some projects that entailed analysis of data from developing countries. And probably most of the people engaged in this project would agree when I say that the data collection systems from developing countries are quite different from the data collection systems from developed countries. So it seems high time for us, if we want to be one of the leading research centers that aim to arrest proliferation of social disadvantage, not only within Australia, but all over the world, to start learning more about how data are being collected from developing countries. So for my analysis, most of the data are based on two surveys from the Philippines. These are the Family Income and Expenditure Survey and the Labor Force Survey. Technically, these surveys are cross-sectional in nature. However, starting 2003, the Philippine National Statistics Office have introduced the 2003 redesigned master sample, which allow a subsample of the respondents to be followed over time, only when they stayed in the same dwelling unit. So in my sample, I'm looking at the 6,519 households that appeared in all three waves, 2003, 2006, 2009. Now, if we compare the features of the full cross-sectional sample with the longitudinal subsample, especially since our main characteristic of interest is household income, per capita household income. We would see that the longitudinal subsample would underestimate the mean income and the variance of income of the full cross-sectional sample. A possible reason for this is that, as I mentioned earlier, they are not following household units moving up, households who are moving up. The thing is, most of these migrating households, tend to have statistically significantly higher income than the rest of the population. So excluding them from the sample would underestimate our income measure. So what we have done is to introduce some survey weight adjustments to address this non-coverage bias. And I must also point out that the income measure that we're using is adjusted to account for inflation and the price differences across geographic regions in the world, in the Philippines, I'm sorry. Okay, so that being said, the first thing that we might want to ask is it relevant to talk about income mobility in the Philippines? Is there income mobility in the first place? No, what we know so far based from existing literature is that total economic growth in the country is quite fast, approximately 5% for the past decade. However, between 2003 to 2009, average household income, per capita household income, grew by only 0.4% annually. And if you look at $2 poverty rate, it went down, barely changed from 45% to 44%. The same thing about income inequality, barely changed from 0.44 to 0.43. So given these numbers, it seems that the household income distribution in the Philippines seems to be stagnant. Is that really the case? Is there no income mobility? Now this figure shows relative income mobility in the Philippines between 2003 to 2009. So the color of the each person, each individual, corresponds to the income quintile based on their initial income in 2003. Come in. And then the colors of the bar correspond to the income quintile of the person in 2009. If we look at the poorest quintile, about 40% experience upward mobility. Particular 30% experience went up a quintile higher, while 10% moved to middle income status. If we look at the next poorest quintile, we can see that about 40% remained in the same income quintile, 30% went down, and 30% went up. If we look at, as we move along the other income groups, we can see relative mobility happening. So this just summarizes the total relative mobility in the Philippines between 2003 to 2009. And even if we look at within quintiles, there's still mobility. This color parade is another way of presenting an income transition matrix. If there is no relative mobility, the data would look something like this. However, if we look at the actual data, this is what we get. In other words, we have relative mobility. However, there's one problem about relative mobility. It's only one dimension of income mobility. The thing is, if, for example, if we uniformly halved or doubled or tripled all incomes of all respondents, it will not show any relative mobility. So how do we capture this type of income changes? We look at other measures of mobility. And in this case, we look at changes in the absolute income levels. Now, if we look at the changes in average income growth per quintile, we see that the initially poorest quintile experienced 6% income growth, while the richest income quintile experienced negative income growth, about 2% per year. No, what we can get from these numbers is that it seems that the income of the poor are growing much faster compared to the income of the rich. However, before we conclude that the development process is pro-poor, we have to ask ourselves, is the observed income mobility genuine? What do I mean by that? So suppose you have this person belonging in the poorest income quintile. And suppose he won a small-scale lottery, which brought him up to the middle income status. And we stop our observation period here. What we can get is that the development process benefited this poor. However, actually, it was only because of random luck. Had we continued observing the income trajectory of this person, it is possible that in the long run, he's still poor. Simply because probably he lacks the ability to invest his resources to more productive investment. So how do we account for this kind of random luck? If we want to control for that, in the data, what we will see is that there is much less income mobility. For example, initially when we just look at we did not control for random fluctuations, about 40% of the initially poor went up. However, if we control for random income fluctuations, only 20% of the initially poorest quintile observed upward mobility. And that kind of pattern can also be seen if we look at absolute income mobility. Initially, we observe a 6% income growth for the poorest quintile, but when we control for random fluctuations, it's only about 2%. And actually, the richest quintile did not, somehow their income is very changed, about positive 0.3% per year. Having said that, there are other types of dimensions of income mobility. But just to save time, we've covered different dimensions just to check whether there is income mobility in the Philippines. We have done more sophisticated statistical analysis compared to what have been presented earlier. And these are just some of them. But basically, it's just a robustness check just to check whether there is income mobility. So I will not explain that in detail, but what we can get from all these results is that the income distribution in the Philippines is much more dynamic than we conventionally perceive based on changes in cross-sectional trends in poverty and income inequality. However, significant positive and negative mobility exists, and they tend to offset each other. So when you add them up, they tend to cancel, so we observe very minimal income growth at the aggregated level. Moreover, the contribution of the random income fluctuations to the observed mobility is quite significant, so it has to be taken into account when doing some analysis. Okay, so at this point we have established that there is significant income mobility in the Philippines, so it is a relevant topic to be talked about. So to continue our investigation, we might want to ask, who are these people? Who are income mobile? Now, what we know based from existing literature, actually there's not much that we know because there have been very limited studies in the Philippines about income mobility. There are some few, but they only focus on movements within a low income threshold, so movements into and out of poverty. What they are seeing is that those exited poverty are mostly those who managed to move away from low productive sectors. So in my analysis, what I want to do is to extend this by looking at income mobility, not only at the low income range, but for the entire income distribution. Now, I group the income mobility outcomes for all survey respondents into 5 clusters. The first cluster corresponds to those who did not experience much mobility between 2003 to 2009. That is about 34% of the population. For the second cluster, these are the people who experience consistently upward mobility. 27%. Third cluster experienced consistently negative mobility. And the fourth and fifth clusters are those who experience erratic income flows over time. Now, and then I estimated several logistic models to find the profile of this each cluster. What I'm finding is that low, middle, and high income households experience statistically significant income trajectories. In particular, if we look at lower income households, they are more likely to be classified under the second cluster. Middle income households were least likely to be classified under fourth or fifth clusters, while the richest households tend to have the most erratic income outflows over time. And then some stylized findings, which are quite consistent with some of the literature in other countries. Higher educational attainment and lower dependency ratio are positively correlated with being classified under the second cluster. However, increasing family size is correlated with being classified under the third cluster. And once we have observed occupational transitions, they are more likely to observe significant income mobility. Okay, so what we have gathered so far is that the poor seem to have slightly better income mobility outcomes than the rich. But is that enough? Can that give us the assurance that the Philippines is poised to be the next Asian tiger and we will be able to end poverty in the future? Well, it's one thing that the income of these poor are growing faster than the incomes of the rich. But it's another thing if these poor are staying in poverty for a long time. It is possible that even with faster income growth, it could still take generations before the poorest of the poor can get out of poverty. So to be able to answer that, we examine the poverty duration characterize the poverty duration in the Philippines. As I pointed out earlier, there have been several studies about movements into and out of poverty. And most of them are finding that poverty in the Philippines is mostly chronic or persistent in nature. Well, there are some limitations about these studies. Most of them have been using quite different methodologies. And they were not testing the robustness of the estimates. One thing that we have to take note about estimation of poverty duration is that it is quite sensitive with the methodology, with the poverty line that you're using, with the poverty index that you're using. So I want to check whether these results hold across different methodologies. So in general, when examining poverty duration, there are two general approaches. First one is the components approach. Suppose in panel data, we have income at different time periods. So in some instances, you might have low income. In some instances, you might have high income. Under the components approach, what we do is to estimate the long-term income, or what we call permanent income. If we have very few time points, which is the case in the Philippines, the simplest thing to do is to take the longitudinal average. Of course, we have already accounted for inflation, so it's valid to take the average. And once we get this longitudinal average, that will serve as our estimate of our permanent income. When the permanent income is higher than the poverty line, we will say that that person is not persistently poor. If it's lower, then that person is considered persistently poor. On the other hand, an alternative to the components approach is the spells approach. Unlike the components approach, in the spells approach, we gauge the poverty status of the person at each time point. So for example, at the first time point, we say that person is poor, and then at the second time point, he's non-poor, third time point is poor. And then we count the frequency of the person being classified as poor. If it exceeds a certain number of thresholds, then we consider him persistently poor. Otherwise, he's not persistently poor. So what we can get from this is that even if we're working with the same data, we can get different results. So in my study, I use both the spells approach and the components approach. Of course, I'm also using different poverty indices and poverty lines. So depending on the methodology being used, there are about 18 to 37 million persistently poor Filipinos based on the $2 a day poverty line. And that accounts for between 60% to 95% of the total observed poverty. On the other hand, transient poverty accounts for about 5%, to 40% of the total observed poverty. So what we can get from this is that, okay, it's quite consistent with the results based on existing literature. The relative importance of persistent and transient poverty really depend on the methodology that you're using. In particular, we find that as the poverty line decreases, or the poverty index become more sensitive to the ill fare of the poorest of the poor, we tend to observe a more important contribution of transient poverty. And then another important thing that I have to point out is that this sensitivity of the poverty duration estimates with the methodology being used should make us cautious about interpreting poverty rankings. For instance, consider this. One of the programs adopted by the government in the previous year was entailed identification of the 20 poorest provinces. But in our analysis, this list of 20 poorest is not necessarily fixed. So depending on what kind of poverty we're looking at, the characteristics of the poor households differ. For instance, if you look at the persistently poor, most of them are located in the southern part of the Philippines. However, when we look at the transiently poor, most of them are located up north. So really, we have to explain what kind of poverty we are measuring. So that will be able to guide policymakers. For instance, it has different policy implications. For persistent poverty, maybe the appropriate policy is to provide long-term human development for these people. But for the transiently poor, probably a better way to address this is to provide social safety nets. Okay, so so to be able to proceed to policies, we have to identify which factors are important in describing income mobility. What components of income are driving the observed variations in income mobility outcomes? We have done some counterfactual analysis, and what we are seeing is that 49% of the observed mobility can be attributed to changes in income from labor, employment income. 25% can be attributed to changes in asset income, 20% from changes in remittance income, 3% from changes in transfers from government social assistance, and 3% from changes in other income sources. What we can get from this is that it is quite important, employment is quite important to induce income mobility. So for the poor, labor is just one of their few productive assets. So that should be used by the government to induce positive income mobility. However, if we look at the employment trends in the Philippines, non-standard employment arrangements are on the rise. And its impact on the income mobility outcomes in the Philippines is worth investigating. So right now, that is what we are currently doing. Okay, so more on the technical side of this research. So far, we have covered the substantive side about the income mobility profile in the Philippines. One thing about estimating income mobility is that it is premised with the availability of panel data. However, if we look at other developing countries, unlike the Philippines, they don't have any panel data. Or in the case of the Philippines, they have panel data, but it's only for a quite short period of time. So how do we reconcile the need to provide a more dynamic perspective in the analysis of the income distribution when we don't have, or when we lack panel data? Okay, I hope you find this funny. No, okay, so when we have panel data, so we track each respondent over time. So this good-looking kid, we know what happened to him after several years. This very handsome young man. But what if we don't have panel data and we only have cross-sectional data? Since this kid is not being followed, we don't really know if he became miserable or he enjoyed himself after several years. However, based on existing literature, what we can they are saying that even if repeated cross-sectional data are not following the same set of respondents, you can still use them to create synthetic or pseudo-panels and proceed to estimation of income mobility. That is what we call pseudo-panel estimation. Pseudo-panel estimation in general entails borrowing information from statistical neighbors. So for example, we look at respondents from the survey who we think are quite the same with the person that we are imputing for, and then you combine that information to get an imputed value. By the way, that's not me, that's my brother, so you don't get an exact estimate for that good-looking kid. So we use that as estimated value for the person that we want to estimate. So there are different ways of borrowing information. One of the widely used approaches was proposed by Angus Dyson. Basically, it entailed grouping all individuals, survey respondents, into cohort groups, say based on sex or gender, or date of birth. So for example, we can group all individuals who were born between 1960s to 1970s, 1970s to 1980s, and so on. And then we take the average income of each cohort group. So that cohort average is now what we use as the synthetic panels, because they will be representative across all survey periods. Well, it's a good approach, and actually it's been fairly developed because, of course, there are several issues about, more technical issues about, you're adding up fixed effects, so what will be the distribution of that fixed effects and so on. Nevertheless, most of the approaches that have stemmed from the Dyton's approach still use cohort level data. The problem with cohort level data is we're using a lot of information. And in addition to losing a lot of information, it's only appropriate for a very limited dimension of income mobility. So now what we're currently looking at is to develop a statistical methodology that will keep the individual or household as the atomic unit, as the unit of level of analysis. And there are different approaches that we're looking at. The good thing is, since we have actual panel data, we can actually gauge the performance of the pseudo-panel data-based approaches. So this is just the table comparing panel versus pseudo-panel in terms of movements into and out of poverty. And this one is for comparing a more general list of income mobility indices. Well, so far the results are quite encouraging in the sense that the estimates based on the pseudo-panel are quite close for the estimates based on the actual panel data. However, there are still some issues that we have to carefully look into. In particular, the performance of the pseudo-panel-based approaches is quite satisfactory only when we're looking at income mobility indices that are function of the difference of the average income, but less satisfactorily when we're looking at income mobility indices which are functions of the difference in the variance of income. So that's what we're currently working on. And okay, so just to summarize what I've been talking about for the last 45 minutes, income growth, average income growth, cross-sectional trends in poverty and income inequality, they are not really, they do not really provide a complete appraisal of the a country's socioeconomic development. Income mobility provides a more comprehensive tool for examining the dynamics or the evolution of the income distribution. However, given its multidimensional feature, we have to look into different types of income mobility, and especially try to relate it, how it will affect the policy implications differently. For example, earlier I mentioned about the difference of policy implications for persistent and transient poverty. So that said, policies should not only focus on the persistently poor, for example. It should be a balance between long-term human development capital and provision of social protection schemes. More importantly, on the technical side, it is quite important to invest, especially for developing countries, on the collection of more relevant statistics that will actually help policymakers provide an evidence-based policymaking. I think this is quite being recognized now by many developing countries. So, for example, longitudinal data is gradually becoming more available, which allows us to study income mobility. But the thing is, it might take more time before these developing countries to have a data collection system that is quite on par with the data collection systems of developed countries. So in the meantime, if we want to really get a better sense of the socioeconomic development, we have to develop statistical tools that will optimize the use of the available data for that developing countries. So with that, thank you very much for listening. I'm happy to answer easy questions. If you have different difficult ones, we can address it to Wojtek and my two other supervisors, Mark and Michelle.